Hi, everyone. My name is Maris Kreisman, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you tonight to another excellent event at McNally Jackson. If you go to mcnallyjackson.com and look at our events calendar, you'll see all the amazing writers and programs we're hosting in the coming weeks. Please keep an eye on the site or subscribe to our newsletter to hear more about what's coming soon. There will be time at the end of tonight's conversation for your questions, so start thinking about them now. And you can use the Zoom chat function to submit any questions you have, and we'll get to them towards the end of the evening. We're glad that even though we can't all be in the same room at the moment, we're still able to host events during this difficult time. As we've weathered the pandemic and reopened all 4 of our locations for browsing and shopping, indie bookstores like ours still need more support. And so if you enjoy free events like this one and want us to keep hosting more of them, please buy books from us. Throughout the evening, I'll post links in the chat to buy American Delirium from McNally Jackson. I'm so happy to welcome you here tonight to celebrate Betina González's English language debut novel, American Delirium, with her translator, Heather Cleary, and with special guest, Carlos Fonseca. Betina González is the best-selling author of several novels and short story collections. She earned her MFA in bilingual creative writing at the University of Texas at El Paso and her PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. She lives in Buenos Aires and teaches at the University of Buenos Aires and New York University, Buenos Aires. Heather Cleary's translations have been finalists for the National Translation Award and the Best Translated Book Award, and she holds a PhD in Latin American and Iberian cultures from Columbia University. She lives in New York and teaches at Sarah Lawrence College. And Carlos Fonseca was born in San Jose, Costa Rica, and spent half of his childhood and adolescence in Puerto Rico. He's the author of the novels Natural History and Colonel Lagrimas, and in 2018, he won the National Prize for Literature in Costa Rica for his book of essays, La Lucidez del Miope. He teaches at Trinity College, Cambridge, and lives in London. So happy to welcome you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mary. First of all, thanks so much to McNally Jackson, definitely one of my favorite spaces in all of New York. I wish this pandemic is over and we could be there right now. But this is a lovely space as well. And thanks to Henry Holt for publishing this amazing novel. We'll talk soon about the process, how it got to be published and everything and how it got to be translated. But most importantly, congratulations, Betina, and congratulations, Heather. I was just telling you guys right now, and I repeat it again, I'm amazed and I'm in love with the book, American Delirium. I was rereading it today and I was just impressed. So I am very happy for both of you today. I think it's publication day today, right? Okay, so double congratulations. I thought that we could begin maybe by thinking through most books, it's true what they say, it's very easy to put a very beautiful epigraph, but it's very hard for books to earn that epigraph and that beauty. And I think your book, Betina, it's one of those books where I read the epigraph and then I read the book and it's wow, Betina really got it, right? You were able to write a book that was able to sustain that beautiful epigraph by Jean Baudrillard, in which he asked for us readers basically to enter into that fiction that is America, right? And he says also to enter America as fiction. And when I was rereading the book today, I realized that that's what you do. You kind of lead us there to that place where the fears and the fantasies that constitute America, right? That vague word, that vague world, kind of linked to a very specific narrative kind of plot. So congratulations. And I thought we could perhaps begin by doing the most important thing in literature, which would be listening to the voice of the author and the translator, reading some excerpts. The novel is, I believe, just to tell you a little bit, is structured around 3 main characters or 3 main kind of narratives, paths or ways that we could follow. And I believe that you guys are going to read from each one of those 3 sections, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right. Thank you so much, Carlos, for presenting this book tonight. It's an honor and it's exciting chance to talk about the project with you. So just for a little bit of background, the novel is told in 3 voices follows 3 characters as their lives kind of intertwine and then diverge and then come back together in unexpected ways. Meanwhile, in the background, hordes of deer are kind of taking over this small city in what is the Midwest, we imagine, but is never named. And as the deer are crowding in, hordes of people are moving out to kind of drop out of society and join various communes. And the theme that connects all of this, or the substance that connects all of this, is a hallucinogen derived from a rare flower called the albaria. So I think that should be enough to be able to place these brief fragments that we'll read. The first comes from a character named Vic. Each chapter begins with Vic's perspective, and then we move through Beryl and Berenice. Did you want to start reading in Spanish, Betina, and then we'll...
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you for summarizing the plot. I hate that part always. So thank you for doing it for me, Heather. So this is Vic. I'm going to read a few lines and then Heather is going to take over. El día que descubrió una mujer escondida en uno de sus armarios, Vic había soñado que ganaba un torneo de ping-pong. Los dos hechos no estaban relacionados, excepto por el sentimiento de triunfo seguido del asco, que era más o menos el mismo. Entrar a su casa midiendo sus pasos, acercarse a la puerta del closet y apoyar la oreja en la madera, equivalía a la calculada, perfecta trayectoria de su brazo en el sueño, que colocaba la pelota fuera del alcance de su adversario.
Excellent, thank you. And just to give this a little bit more of a postmodern spin, I'm not actually going to read the same paragraph. I'm going to start a little bit later. But this gives us a sense of the language and the rhythm, because each of these voices is very distinct. So that was Vic in Spanish. This is slightly later in the same section. Vic wasn't sure exactly when it had begun. A few nights ago, probably, when he got home from the gym and noticed that the house smelled like sandalwood. He didn't remember lighting incense before he left, nor did he like sandalwood. After much searching, he'd eventually found a box of incense on one of the sofas, but he didn't think much of it and had headed for the shower. The walk from the bus station had been an ordeal, even though it was only a few blocks. It was raining, which always slowed him down. He preferred to take his time rather than risk making a false move with his cane and falling in front of the neighbors, especially since he insisted on wearing leather shoes, which really weren't suited to the climate. His doctor had suggested he try something more appropriate. What did he expect? For him to start wearing those horrible trainers that teenagers put on their feet to feel faster, stronger, tougher? Vic knew that, just like the pill bottles on his nightstand and the half-hour of exercises he suffered through daily, it was all simply meant to help his doctor sleep at night. The fact was that his nervous system had been deteriorating for years and no one knew why. He had a collection of ultrasounds that showed bits of connective tissue floating at random around his spinal column. They looked like malevolent little creatures or fish, like part of some alternative design his body had decided to adopt. Intelligent, translucent lines composing the sharp and bottomless shape of the word pain.
Thank you. So that's Vic. This is Beryl. Beryl is an old lady who used to be a hippie in better days. So now she talks ladies. Mi primer ciervo tenía pintas en el lomo. Lo maté con un Marlin 336. Entonces yo no lo sabía, pero las pintas significaban que el animal no tenía más de 6 meses. Se supone que es ilegal cazarlo tan jóvenes. Papá no me dijo nada de eso. Me felicitó y masajeó un rato mi hombro, donde el rifle, después de varios días de práctica intensiva, me había dejado un moretón azul.
This one does match up. My first deer still had its spots. I killed it with a Marlin 336. I didn't know it at the time, but the spots meant that the animal was less than 6 months old. It's illegal to hunt them when they're that young, but Dad didn't mention that part. He congratulated me and rubbed my shoulder, right where the rifle had left a dark blue bruise over days of practice. It was years before I went back to it. So much can happen to a girl in a city like this, especially when you get to be a certain age. People wrinkle their noses at you as they pass, like they can smell the thousands of dead cells you're carrying inside, the microscopic trail you leave behind, like a slug. But it's not true. Not everything inside me is rotting. Sometimes I'd like to prove them right, though. There's nothing worse than having someone hand you your fears gift wrapped. Why not show them what's waiting for them around the bend? Most of them act like they're immortal, like they've got all the time in the world to decide between the skim milk and the kind with 2% fat and all the vitamins they'll need to delay the moment they need to start wearing diapers again. Sometimes I'm tempted to do something awful, like stop the chick coming my way with her kid in a shopping cart and scream right in his freckled little face. To him, I'm just a Halloween mask or a pile of dirty clothes someone forgot to pick up. I consider worse. At the very least, someone should teach them a few survival skills. The average family in this country wastes 25 pounds of food per year. Fact. And that's not even counting the tons of garbage they produce. They think they can make it all better by putting their newspapers and magazines in a little blue bin every night, their glass bottles in a red one, and everything else in the trash. Then they go to sleep and dream of buying a bigger house, having their picture in one of those magazines, spicing things up with the old ball and chain. They're like little kids, wouldn't last 2 hours on their own. In the morning, they hop in their giant pickup trucks and forget all about it. When the deer started attacking people, no one thought it was important enough to put it on the news. Only a few of us saw it for what it was, another sign of our weakness. The rest just went on planting their tomatoes, making sure they got enough fiber, and keeping up with events in the Middle East. They didn't react, not even when the deer started coming in droves. Their faith in the assurances of ecologists, in the government, and in their weekly salsa lessons never wavered. They probably read about what happened to Ron Duda the way you might read about the genetic mutation of a fly in some remote tropical region, or an exotic disease that, thank God, only affects people with one eye, or those of us constantly on the verge of falling off society's radar. It didn't occur to them that Duda could be their neighbor, another moron whose fences and intercoms failed to protect them from their love of nature.
So that was Beryl, and this is Berenice, which is my favorite character. It's a little girl. La primera noche que pasó sola en el departamento de la calle Edmond, tuvo cuidado de encender el televisor y una de las lámparas. Se quedó dormida en el sillón. A la mañana siguiente, su madre todavía no había vuelto. La segunda noche fue igual. Y la tercera.
So this actually, this section of Berenice's narrative is available on Electric Lit. So if you're enjoying what you're hearing, you can actually read the whole section online. Her first night alone in the apartment on Edmund Street, she made sure to turn on the television and one of the lights. She fell asleep on the couch. Morning came and her mother still wasn't back. The second night was the same. So was the third. For 3 days, she ate leftover chicken and slept on the couch, not wanting to upset the delicate balance of a life Emma Lynn might return to at any moment. She went to school, trying to act normal and not think. Whenever her doubts crept up on her in the middle of a class or a conversation with her classmates, she'd cage them inside a battle cry, a sharp twist of her neck, a tug of her hair. Some of the kids probably saw her bite her arm or mutter a few words into the wind, but she was sure none of them suspected she'd become a left behind. The dropouts abandoned their children in public places, sometimes without warning. Sometimes they planned it out. It was part of the call. It was happening less and less, but it still happened. They left the children in front of churches or schools, or more often, in front of City Hall. They never considered leaving their children with relatives. That would undermine the gesture. Part of the idea was that they were rejecting the duty of parenthood and returning the children to their rightful guardians. Mothers and fathers were going on strike. They cursed the day they had agreed to participate in this crumbling society by bringing more people into it, and hoped that their withdrawal would overwhelm its institutions, speeding its collapse. But that day never came. The government found ways to deal with the left behinds. At first, they sent them to orphanages, but people started to complain that the regular orphans were being mixed in with the children of those maniacs. A special shelter was set up for them, farms and factories too, so the older ones could be used for manual labor. This may have taken a toll on the opposition. It showed them that the system had 1,001 strategies for turning their protests into production. And then I'm just going to read one tiny paragraph from a little bit later in the same section, just to come back to Berenice. The first thing Berenice did when she got back to the apartment that Thursday was lower the blinds. She had to take inventory and didn't want the neighbors to know, especially not Mr. Mueller, who could show up at any moment asking about her mother. She stood on a chair and started pulling the cans and jars from the cupboards and setting them on the kitchen counter. According to her calculations, she had enough food to last her several months, at least through the winter. She found some money under the mattress of the pull-out couch where her mother slept, along with a gold ring she'd never seen before. Emma kept her jewelry in a heart-shaped box, and Berenice had always helped her pick out what looked best with the dress she was wearing. She was sure her mother had never worn that ring, a thin gold band with a sad little diamond straining up from it. She sat there for a long time, turning it over between her fingers. This she could live on for a while.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Heather and Bettina. That's a perfect sampler. It kind of showcases, first of all, the beauty of the language itself in the novel, and also something that kept me going back and forth in the novel, which is that on the one hand, it is a very Argentinian novel in the sense that it has to do with this tradition of lo fantastico, this uncanny at the very kind of core of reality. So what I was reading, I was I had just been reading with my students Casa Tomada from Cortázar, and I was thinking about that. But at the same time, it's a very American book at the same time, because it's a book that you could link to the Lila, you could link to Pynchon, you could link to the rise of countercultural and paranoid societies in 1960s and so on. So I'm interested in that double-sidedness of the novel and how it relates to the context of publication. So the novel was, I believe, Bettina published in 2016 in Argentina to great critical acclaim. And I was wondering, how does that critical acclaim and that, reception is being mirrored or changing in any way now that I see it being so well received and loved in the US within, I guess, another tradition and another context. But yeah, it was interesting that thing is a very Argentine novel and very American at the same time.
Interesting. I love that you say that, because I'm doing some interviews online and writing my answers. And today somebody asked me if I was an Argentine writer or an American writer, right? So what I said, I'm going to repeat what I said, is that you always write with a whole library in your head, right? So it is hard to define yourself as a writer, but I think you're right. And some of them, of the topics and forms and approaches of the Argentine tradition are in the novel, like you mentioned Cortázar, or you mentioned the Fantástico, Rio Platense, right? Also some of the American, traditions. So I like to walk that line, to write in that, within that limit, right? And to try to make something different, because I think the novel is neither American or Argentinian, it's just a novel. And here, some reviews took it as a dystopic novel or a post-apocalyptic novel. I guess they wanted to, place it within a genre. Critics always want to do that. And for me, it was surprising, because I wasn't thinking about dystopia or a post-apocalyptic event when I was writing it. I was just a little bit farther than what we can call realism. For me, it's a novel that works with distortion and works with, what I will call it speculative fiction, if I had to say something.
Amazing. No, I couldn't coincide like more. Like, you know, I believe, you know, novels are just novels, and one writes with everything that one has, right? Great. Let's talk a little bit about translation, right? Which is what is gathering us here today. I believe that this is the first project, like full-length, like book project, that you work alongside an English translator. Am I right in thinking that it's American Delirium is the first novel that you guys work together? So tell me a little bit about the process. And like we were talking before about how much one learns about one's own book when one, like, you know, has to go through the process. So it'd be lovely to, like, you know, hear from both you and Heather. How was the process like? When did you guys meet each other? What do you like now see of the novel in this process of translation that you perhaps hadn't seen before?
Well, I can start with how we met, which is actually through a mutual friend. I was studying at Columbia with a writer named Juan Alvarez from Colombia, who had studied with Betina. And so he passed me one of her novels. He said, I think you might like Betina's work, and I did. That was a while ago, and we started talking, and slowly I translated, I think it was a story first, and then we started thinking about presenting novels and which one to begin with, right, in the new marketplace. And it's all of those conversations that took place over years. But in terms of this specific project, I don't know, would you like to jump in, Betina, about what the process was like on this book?
No, I just want to say that Juan Alvarez, my dear friend, should be here right now. I'm going to be mad at him if he's not. He promised to be.
Well, then maybe he is, and in that case, hello. And thank you. Well, one of the things, I guess, just to start about the translation process of this book, I usually hold questions, kind of specific questions, until the end of the process. But I did start very early in conversation with Betina and kind of trying to sketch out the nature of these three different voices. Because with Beryl, it's very clear. It's a first person. It's a monologue. She's speaking to a camera and recounting her story for posterity. So there's a very kind of clear voice there that is both kind of justifying and also kind of raging at times and being vulnerable at times. And she's a very rich character emotionally, and it's first person. So that was a little bit easier to kind of wrap my head around. But then with Vic and Berenice, they're both third person narrators, but with very subtle differences in the way that that narrative is constructed. And with Berenice, it's kind of a dark fairy tale. It has this sort of magical quality, and she's on this quest. And for Vic, it was interesting. I mean, his character is much more. He's sort of a misanthrope. He's bitter that, you know, he had to immigrate to the United States when the island where he grew up in a pretty privileged position was subject to a volcanic explosion, and he had to flee and seek refuge in the United States. So he's not the character who's, you know, very excited to be where he is. He's a little bit, he thinks he's superior to the people around him. So those were kind of the strains that we established in our early conversations. And also thinking about Vic's English as being marked by the colonial legacy of on his island, which went from Spanish to English colonialism. So that's why actually in the section that I read, he refers to what we would call sneakers in the United States as trainers, just to kind of like shade that a little bit with there's a few moments like that. So.
And I guess I have a question for you just from a technical perspective. So the novel is structured in such like a fascinating way because it jumps between the different voices. And I was wondering, like, when I was reading it, like, I was wondering if, like, each of you, how do you went about it? Like, if Bettina, if you wrote just all of the narrative from like Vic at once linearly, and then you decided like how you were gonna like do this like impressive mosaic or constellation, or whether it was just like, you know, you actually went Vic, Beryl, Berenice, and the same for you, Heather, where you just went and you translated all of Vic's like, you know, kind of like line of like narrative in order to keep that voice, because there are two different rhythms, right? It's the rhythm of the novel itself, but at the same time, it's you want to be like faithful to the rhythm of the voices. So how did you both like deal with that?
Well, at the beginning, I did the combination, right? I was writing the three voices at the same time. At a certain point, it was impossible to do that. I had a huge crisis in the middle of the book because, as you see, the book jumps to the past a lot. Now you have to be very careful, very organized when you are working with storylines, and you are also making a lot of jumping forward and backwards in the lives of the characters. So I have, like, that crisis was so big that I have to abandon the book and write another one. So that's why this novel took a long time to write. And in the middle of it, I wrote Las Poseídas in 9 months. So that book, I don't know, I think I learned a lot by doing that. I mean, it's a complete different book. It has some similarities in the form and, you know, the kind of games I like to play while writing. But, you know, leaving the book for a while helped me to see it, you know, in a more panoramic way. After that, I came back to the book and I was able to finish it doing the opposite, right? Writing each line separately and, you know, paying a lot of attention to the tension, you know. When one of the stories is high in tension, the other ones are not. And that combination took a while, but it was a lot of fun because I'm such a nerd, right? So I like that. I like that challenge. It was fun to do it. And it was something I have never done before in my other books. So I learned that by reading Scott Fitzgerald. It's not that I invented anything. No, he has a theory about forces in the novel and how each character is a force. And, you know, the lives of the characters are forces, and, you know, they have high points and low points. And it's just amazing. He says that in just one letter.
Yeah. And it's also very musical. Yeah, I guess like there's some musicality to it in terms of like
so much. And
Heather, in your case,
yeah, I was completely astounded by Bettina's skill in managing the tension, managing the voices. I mean, it almost feels like a musical piece, right, in the way it's constructed, and it's just exquisite. I luckily didn't have to worry about inventing the structure or inventing the rhythms of these narratives as they unfolded, but I did think a lot about tension and the way that the stories interact. So when I translated, I went through linearly the first time so that I could understand what information was being given and what was still being withheld, and because that affects word choice sometimes and things like that. You don't want to accidentally give anything away. And then for the edits, I went through by voice.
Oh, interesting. Something that we should talk about is the title, right? Already from the title, America is in the title, and then America appears in the epigraph. So like, that's a big theme, right? Like America, and like what is America, like as a fantasy and as a fiction, right? And as a fiction that could be disarticulated or can be like told at the same time. And I was wondering, in that sense, two different things, right? So first of all, Bettina, I don't know where did you meet Juan? Was it in the US or?
No, actually, we did our MFA together. He's a writer from Colombia. You know, we did like 2 years together in El Paso. Then he moved to New York, and you know,
okay.
we became very close friends.
but I believe you spent some time in the US, right? So I was wondering like how that time like that you spent in the US helped shape a little bit of the book, and then also like, you know, I guess you wrote it from outside of like America, but at the same time America is just like a much broader fiction or allegorical space, such as the space that we get in the novel, right? Because we get a town that is never actually like, you know, mentioned by name. It seems to be you know, some Midwestern city, but we are not completely sure. So all of these are like choices that you decided to like make, right? And I was wondering like what went into the process, and also like what living in the US and then moving out and then double kind of like game in between being inside and outside like provided you.
I began to write the novel while I was living in the US. I was living in Pittsburgh. And for me, moving from Texas to Pittsburgh was a big shock, right? Because El Paso didn't feel like America, didn't feel like the US. It's so close to Mexico. And it was so easy to go to Ciudad Juarez if I, you know, wanted to get a little bit of Latin America. So for me, Pittsburgh was the real, you know, America, and it's such an amazing city. It's a city with a rich past, and it's a city of immigrants. But it's also at that time it was a very economically depressed city. So you saw in Pittsburgh, you know, churches on sale, mansions that were, you know, occupied by homeless people or abandoned. And so that was a shock for me, because, you know, you have this idea of the US being the empire, you know, the leader of the world, and you don't expect to find a city like Pittsburgh. And I love that city so much. It is strange because that beauty of the city made me feel at home. I mean, it was so different from Texas. So I started to write about these feelings, right? This contradiction between the America that we see in the movies or in some books and the America I was living in. And very early in the novel, I decided that I didn't want the city to be the city of Pittsburgh. So it has some similarities, but I did a lot of things to change, you know, the geography and the names because of what I said before, right? It's a novel that for me happens nowhere and at the same time everywhere. You know, I invented an island in the Caribbean because I didn't want to, you know, add reality to that universe, right? I wanted to keep it my own. So I did a lot of work, and it takes a lot of work to create a fictional city. You had to be very careful. You had to be very, very consistent. The title came to me at the end after I had already finished the novel. I wanted a title that could say all these things. And I like the word America because it means the whole continent. And in a way, I was reinventing American history, Latin American history at the same time, right? Because it's a novel that also talks about colonialism and about native people in a very subtle way, because it's not at the front of the novel, but it's there. So I like the word America in the title, but it was hard in the translation to keep it like that. So maybe, Heather, you want to talk about how we came up with American Delirium?
A lot of trial and error, I think, is the short answer. In Spanish, the title is América Alucinada, which is different. I mean, we had to change a few things for it to have the same power as a title in English as it does in Spanish. So we went from rather than hallucinated America to then the delirium is sort of a facet of or belonging to this space. but one of the things that keeps coming back in our conversation for me are these continuities, right? The question that you were asked, Betina, about whether you were an Argentine writer or an American writer, and I think one of the things this book does so beautifully is kind of begin to break down those dichotomies, and also break down the sort of the division between the present moment and the past. You do a really, really beautiful job of weaving both colonial history, you know, the 60s and 70s, the movements of the 60s and 70s, and then the current moment, and these tensions that are always different, but they're consistent in the sort of ideological tensions. And so I think that's one of the things that most, from the very first time I read it, most drew me to this book. You do such a good job with it.
Yeah, no, it's impressive, and and it's impressive how the politics also even begins to blur the line between like science and art, which actually reminded me of like another work that I love that you have translated, Heather, which is Roque Laracui's Come Madre, right? Which also begins to blur that. So I saw even continuities within your work as a translator. And I guess you guys are both pointing to like, the second word. So we have been concentrating on America, and it's very important like second aspect of it, which is the delirious aspect of that fantasy, that in this case, in the case of the plot of the novel, has to do with a hallucinogenic, psychedelic plant called alabaria. So perhaps that would be my last question. Like, what is it about that discussion around psychedelics and so on that like allows you, Betina, to talk a little bit about like critiques of society, like how does it allow you to, as Heather mentioned, like so smartly and deftly like tie the history of counterculture in the 1960s to kind of like colonial history to the present? I think that's at the very heart of it.
Oh, wow. I have the feeling that the 60s and the 70s, because I didn't grow up in those decades, were more liberal decades. From this, people were allowed to experiment and allowed to look for different states of consciousness. But what I wanted to do in this novel was to talk about the broken link with nature. So the purpose of that, the plant, the alvaria, is that, it's a question. What if there is a plant that allows you to reconnect with the animals, to reconnect with that state of innocence that we long for, right, as humans? So it was kind of a philosophical question too, right? No, it's not about the drugs. It's not only about the drugs and the music and all the 60s and 70s, but a new take on that, more from our present.
Yeah, definitely. I think that now that you mentioned nature, so I remember, no, of course, like nature and animality, and there seems to be a crisis in civilization that like is provoking this, and you're exploring that crisis that is forcing these people to migrate and look for like, I guess, like spaces of belief. At one point you mentioned something that I loved, which was like, people want to believe, or so you even like, start like exploring like the nature of cults. And the impressive thing that I was very basically impressed by was that you're able to synthetically do it so neatly, right? There's so much, but it doesn't seem like cluttered. It doesn't seem like just like, fragmented. Rather, it seems like it flows just like perfectly. So that I think is impressive. So congratulations again. I see we're getting right to the moment in which we need to ask Q&As. So anybody who has questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I know that Heather and Betina will be glad to answer them. But maybe let's talk a little bit more about that, about nature and the history also of science and the role that science talks, it basically takes in the novel, because you begin like linking it to this whole history of like, natural historians, taxidermy, and that I found fascinating. Also for like, very personal reasons, just because like it's the type of stuff I love. So tell me a little bit how that came into play and what role it plays within the novel.
Wow. Taxidermy. It came at the beginning. It came from the National Science Museum, the Carnegie Museum at Pittsburgh. It's a place, one of them of my favorite places in the city. They have these dioramas, right? Theatrical taxidermy that is kind of scary and at the same time fascinating. And I remember going there to read and because it's a quiet place, and thinking this is not so far from art, right? It's exhibited there in a theatrical way. Why do we call this science and not art? And then I did some research, and I came up with the plaquettes, that are in the novel, and they are amazing works that this guy did in the 19th century, placing stuffed animals, making them play scenes from novels and books. So you have Romeo and Juliet, you had a duel between frogs, and people went to see that, and there was no definition for those works, right? There were neither art, neither science. It was something in between. And I love that idea, the idea of things that can be in between states. So that's why I made Vic a taxidermist. And also because it allowed me to talk about the past also, right? The way that science changed through the centuries, and the way we see it now. We see it as a complete objective discourse that has the final say on everything, but it wasn't always the case. Science can be brutal and can be fun and can be a lot of different things, right? And it's so much related to the work of a writer, of an artist. So it's interesting for me that you mentioned Larraqui's novel, because he does something there that is also in between, right, Heather? So maybe it's also one of your obsessions. We haven't talked about that. your obsession with science-oriented writers.
And I was so grateful to you for giving me an excuse to kind of dig into the specific terminology of taxidermy, right? Because in order to be able to inhabit the body of this character, I needed to know the language. So I spent a lot of time like reading up about plaquettes, which are insane. If you're listening, Google it. It's a whole it's a whole wild world. But yes, no, it is a fascination that I share.
I love it. It's like you can begin to see like the fascinations of, and this is the beautiful thing about translation. You begin to see the fascinations of the translator through this other, filtered through the like works of others, right? So it's an interesting like thing. We have a question from Anjali Rasa-Kolb. We actually have two questions. So I'll tell them both of them together, and then we can take it from there. The first one from Anjali is, I am so excited to read this book. I think the second excerpt you read, there was a phrase that occurs in a number of my favorite apocalypse and contagion novels, My Hobby Horse. It was something like, quote, when the first deer attacks occurred, no one really noticed. It sounds to my ear like it plays on lines from, example, Camus and Lingma in Severance. My question is, since this book was written a few years ago, that's true, do you see it differently in the pandemic moment in terms of how it's being perceived and framed crisis, how it thinks about an emergent phenomenon and what social structures are revealed in this moment? Wonderful question concerning the present and its relationship to literature. And then the second question is from Julia Tomasini. Question for Heather. What did you learn, discover about translation or about you as a translator during this work?
What amazing questions, both of them.
Yeah, amazing.
About the first one, I want to be brief. That quote, I mean, that line about deer attacking people were actually taken from news, from articles that are collected throughout the years. So it is not surprising to me that other writers are also, addressing this issue of this imbalance that we're living in, right? Where suddenly we have deer attacking us. Because I think a fiction writer always is, capturing these oddities and weirdness and that we live in. And that's what drives you to write about your present, right? So I haven't read Severance, but I will. And now that I know that it's connected somehow to my novel.
Can I just ask a follow-up question about that question a little bit? I keep coming back to this. For me, the temporality of translation is so interesting in the way a writer has to move back into their book, or doesn't have to, but in the best case scenario, will move back into their book to be able to answer questions and do these kinds of events after having moved on in their work and worked on other things, and then you go back in. And I was just wondering if going back into this book at this particular moment in time, have new things kind of emerged for you as significant?
Some things, I think, yes. Well, last year was a weird year for all of us, right? We were confined in our houses, but many of us, I made me think about, all the story about this woman living in a closet, living in a closed space in somebody else's house, and the things we value, right? The things that are really important for us. I think we are all doing it, right? Rethinking that. And I think this novel goes to that point, asks a lot of questions like, for example, economical growth, constant growth is something that is not possible in this world. And that is already in the novel. We are talking about that in a very, painful way now. We are suffering from that. Hopefully we'll see, new solutions for that. But it's something that I'm not the only writer that is thinking about this. Many writers have been thinking about this for decades. And it is kind of I don't know, scary, that when you are writing about something, you don't control everything you put into a book. And then something happens in the world that makes you think, oh, well, I was talking about this too, right?
Yeah, I loved Betina. When I read the nota del autor, like the last piece on the author's note, where you tell that you brought so many different pieces from like Japan, and then it becomes evident that your America is like a fictional space where all of these gets like, kind of like woven together. Mm-hmm. Heather, and I guess with Julia Tomasini's question.
Okay, yes.
What did you learn or discover?
What did I discover about translation or about myself as a translator? I discovered about myself as a translator that I absolutely love translating polyvocal works. It was such a joy to kind of look at particularly kind of lexical differences between the different narrative lines and the way a tone could be shifted or a register could be shifted just a little bit. And I discovered that I really love that. Actually, La Come Madre is also, it's similar in that the first and second parts have a different voice. So I had already kind of dipped my toe in, but this was just a full immersion in that, and it was amazing. And what that allowed me to see about translation more generally is, you know, I've always really subscribed to the idea that translation is the most intimate act of reading, that it's an extreme act of close reading, as Gayatri Spivak says. But this novel really made me see the way translation is an act of close listening or intimate listening. There's something also sort of physical about it, and the way of taking in and embodying different voices. And that's something that I found really, really interesting here, and that I want to continue to think about. And
amazing. Well, thanks so much. I believe I see Mary's coming back.
Just to say thank you to all of you, to Betina, Heather, Carlos, and to all of you at home. There's a link in the chat to buy the book, so please do. And thank you for like a wonderful and lovely conversation.
thank you so much for the
Thank
invitation.
you.
Thanks so much.
And thank you all for joining us.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.